The village of Ashford woke up to the sound of heavy wings. It was just after sunrise. The air was cold and the fields were still covered in pale morning mist. Most people were barely out of their beds when the ground began to shake with slow, heavy steps. Children ran to their windows. Old men stepped out of their doorways. Women pulled their little ones close and backed away from the open road. At the far edge of the village, just beyond the stone wall, something enormous appeared through the mist. It was a dragon. She was large, dark-scaled, and moved with the kind of weight that made the earth feel small beneath her. Her wings were folded against her back. Her long neck was low. She was not flying. She was not charging. She was walking slowly, carefully, the way someone walks when they are carrying something they are terrified of dropping. And she was crying. Not roaring. Not growling. Crying. Low, broken sounds came from her throat, sounds that did not belong to something so powerful and so feared. Her golden eyes were wet and wide, and she kept looking down at what she held pressed against her chest. It was a small dragon. A cub. No bigger than a large dog. His dark scales had gone dull and gray at the edges. His tiny wings hung loose. His eyes were shut, and his small body barely moved with each shallow breath. The whole village froze. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. A few people turned and ran straight back into their homes and bolted their doors. A young boy near the well started to cry. His mother picked him up without a word and carried him inside. The village elder, a broad man named Hugh, stepped to the front of the gathering crowd. His face was hard and his jaw was tight. He raised one hand to stop anyone from going further. "Nobody moves," he said quietly. "Nobody does anything." The dragon mother stopped just outside the stone wall. She looked at the humans gathered before her. Her golden eyes moved slowly from face to face, searching. Then she made a sound that none of them expected. It was soft. Almost gentle. Like a question. Hugh did not know what to do. He had lived in Ashford his whole life and had never stood this close to a dragon. Very few people had and walked away to tell about it. His legs were steady but his hands were not. The dragon looked down at her cub again. She made that soft sound once more, and this time it broke at the end, like something cracking under too much weight. That was when Dan stepped forward. He had been standing near the back of the crowd. He was not a large man. Not young, not old. He had plain brown hair and plain clothes and the kind of quiet face that people often forgot in a crowd. He carried a worn leather bag over one shoulder, the kind that smelled of dried herbs and old cloth. He had lived in Ashford for 11 years, and in that time he had treated fevers, set broken bones, stitched wounds, and sat beside people in their final hours. He was the village healer. Nothing more. He pushed gently past the people in front of him. Hugh turned sharply. "Dan. Stop." Dan did not stop. "Dan." Hugh's voice dropped low and firm. "You do not know what that creature will do." "She is not going to do anything," Dan said quietly. He did not say it with anger. He said it the way someone states a simple fact about the weather. "Look at her, Hugh. She came here for help." A few people near him made sharp sounds of disbelief. One woman grabbed his sleeve and he gently pulled free. He walked to the stone wall and stopped there. He was close enough now that he could see the fine detail of the dragon mother's scales, the slow rise and fall of her chest, the tears tracking silently down the side of her long jaw. He did not raise his voice. He did not spread his arms or make any large movement. He simply stood there, looked up at her, and spoke in the same calm tone he used with every frightened patient he had ever treated. "I see you," he said. "I am not going to hurt you or your little one." The dragon's golden eyes fixed on him. Her body went very still. "Can I see the cub?" Dan asked. He waited. He did not step closer. The dragon made a low sound. It was cautious. Uncertain. Her eyes moved to the crowd behind Dan, then back to him. She pulled the cub slightly closer to her chest. "I know," Dan said softly. "I understand." He set his leather bag down on top of the stone wall slowly, making sure she could see exactly what he was doing. He opened it. He reached in and brought out a small bundle of dried herbs, a roll of clean cloth, and a little clay pot with a cork in the top. He laid them out one by one on the wall in plain sight. "These are the only things I have," he said. "Just these." The dragon looked at the items. She looked at his hands. She looked at his face. Her breathing was fast and uneven and her eyes were still wet. Then she looked down at her cub. Kale lay limp and gray against her chest. His small claws hung open. His little face was turned slightly to one side and his breathing was so shallow it was almost nothing at all. A faint, unpleasant smell clung to him, the sweetrot smell that Dan had learned to recognize years ago. He had smelled it in sheep and goats and once in a horse. He knew it. He knew what caused it. And he knew it moved fast. His chest tightened. The dragon let out a long, shaking breath. It was the kind of breath that comes at the end of a very long night when someone has run out of other choices. Slowly, with enormous care, she shifted the cub in her arms. She looked at Dan one last time. He held her gaze and did not look away. Then Sarah lowered her arms and held Kale out toward him. The crowd behind Dan made a collective sound, half gasp, half whisper. Hugh said something sharp that Dan did not hear. The woman who had grabbed his sleeve made a short, frightened noise. Nobody came forward. Dan stepped up to the wall. He reached out carefully, calmly, and placed his hands under the small limp body. The cub was warmer than he expected and heavier too. The gray-edged scales were rough under his fingers. He held Kale close to his chest the same way Sarah had, supporting his head, keeping him still. He looked up at her. "I will do everything I can," he said. Sarah watched him with those wide golden eyes. She did not speak. She did not move. But something in her face changed, the way a face changes when a person finally allows themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone is going to help. Dan picked up his bag with one hand, turned, and walked back toward his small house at the end of the village road. Nobody said a word. Dan laid Kale down on the long wooden table in the center of his house. It was a simple room. A small fireplace on one wall. Shelves lined with jars, bundles of dried herbs, folded cloth, and little clay pots. A single window that looked out toward the eastern fields. The morning light came through it in a pale, quiet beam and fell across the table where the cub now lay. Dan set his bag down and stood over Kale for a moment. He did not rush. He never rushed at the start. Rushing at the start was how people miss things, and missing things in his work had consequences. He placed 2 fingers gently against the side of the cub's neck, just below the jaw, and held them there. The pulse was there. Weak, and too fast, but there. He let out a quiet breath. Then he began. He started at the face. The cub's eyes were closed and the skin beneath the scales around his nose and mouth had gone a dull, yellowish color. Dan pressed very lightly along the jaw and down the throat. Kale did not stir. That was not a good sign. A cub this age should have reacted to being touched by a stranger. The fact that he did not meant the infection had already pulled him somewhere deep. Dan moved down to the chest. He pressed his ear close and listened. The breathing was thin and uneven, with a faint wet sound underneath it that came and went. He straightened and moved to the small foreleg on the left side. He found it there. Just above the joint, hidden beneath a fold of scale where the leg met the body, there was a dark patch of swelling. The skin there was tight and hot. Too hot. At the very center of the swelling, barely visible, was a small blackened point, the entry wound. Around it the flesh had gone a deep, angry red that spread in thin lines outward like the roots of a plant under the skin. Dan looked at it for a long moment without touching it. He knew exactly what this was. Thorn root. The plant grew in deep forest ground, low and spreading, almost invisible underfoot. Its thorns were small and hooked and broke off easily in flesh. On their own they were not dangerous. But thornroot thorns carried a natural resin on their tips, a slow resin that seeped into the blood and began to thicken it. In animals it caused fever, then weakness, then organ failure. He had seen it in livestock twice before. Once in a neighbor's old horse, once in a flock of sheep near the river. Both times he had caught it in time. Both times, just barely. He did not know if the same treatment would work on a dragon cub. The body in front of him was different from anything he had worked on before. The scales, the bone structure, the internal heat of the creature, all of it was unknown to him. But the swelling looked the same. The spreading lines looked the same. The smell was the same. And he had nothing else to go on. He turned to his shelves and began moving quickly but carefully. He took down a dark jar of drawn bark oil, a small folded packet of powdered gray moss, a clean bowl, and the clay pot he had brought outside earlier. He uncorked the clay pot and poured a careful measure of pale liquid into the bowl. Then he added the moss powder in slow pinches, watching the color of the mixture shift from pale to a dull green. He added 3 drops of the bark oil and stirred everything together with a thin wooden rod. While the mixture settled he put a small iron pan on the fireplace hook and let it warm. He tore clean cloth into long strips and laid them across the back of a chair near the fire. There was a sound at the door. Not a knock. Just a presence. A shadow fell across the window and Dan glanced over his shoulder. Sarah had moved from the village wall. She was outside his house now, crouched low with her long neck stretched toward the small window. Her golden eyes were fixed on Cale. Her breath fogged the glass in slow, uneven clouds. Dan looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to his work. "He is still breathing," he said, loud enough to carry through the glass. "I found the cause. I am working on it now." He did not know if she understood his words. But the sound at the window shifted slightly, and the fogging on the glass slowed a little. He turned back to Cale and leaned close over the swollen area again. He needed to draw out the thorn tip. If it stayed in the flesh the resin would keep spreading no matter what he applied from the outside. He selected a thin iron tool from a small roll of instruments, cleaned the tip in the warm pan, and waited for it to cool just enough. Then, with steady hands and very slow pressure, he worked. It took a long time. The thorn tip was deep and the surrounding flesh was swollen tight around it. He had to stop twice to let the tissue relax. He did not force anything. Forcing caused damage and damage caused more problems. He simply worked with patience, millimeter by millimeter, until the small black tip finally came free on the end of the instrument. He held it up in the light. Tiny. Barely the size of a grain of rice. Hard to believe something so small could bring a creature this size so close to the edge. He set it aside and immediately began applying the green mixture to the wound and along the red lines spreading from it. He worked it in gently with his fingertips, covering every line he could see. Then he wrapped the area in the warm cloth strips, firm but not tight, and tied them off. Cale made a sound for the first time. It was very small. A low, faint sound from somewhere in his throat. Not pain exactly. More like the sound of something shifting, something changing. His small claws twitched once on the table surface and then went still again. Dan pressed his fingers to the cub's neck again. The pulse was still fast, but it felt slightly stronger than before. Slightly. He was not ready to call that a good sign yet. The next few hours would decide everything. The body either accepted the treatment or it did not. He covered Kale carefully with a folded cloth to keep his warmth in and pulled a stool close to the table. He sat down, rested his arms on the table edge, and settled in to watch. Outside the window, Sarah had not moved. And beyond her, in the village road, the people of Ashford had gathered in a long, quiet line. Nobody spoke. Nobody left. They stood in the cold morning air and watched the small house at the end of the road with wide, uncertain eyes. Hugh stood at the front of them. His arms were crossed. His face was hard to read. But he had not left either. The afternoon passed slowly. Dan did not leave the table. He checked Kale's pulse every hour, pressing 2 fingers gently to the same spot below the jaw each time and counting in his head. He checked the temperature of the wrapped leg. He watched the rise and fall of the small chest. He watched the color of the skin around the nose and mouth to see if the yellow tint was fading or deepening. It was not fading yet. But it was not deepening either. That was enough, for now. The fire in the small hearth burned low in the afternoon and Dan added 2 more logs without taking his eyes off the cub for long. He ate nothing. He drank a little water from a cup on the shelf. Outside the window the sky turned from pale blue to the deep orange of late afternoon and then slowly to gray. Sarah had not moved. She was crouched just outside the house, her large body folded as small as she could make it, her long neck resting along the ground with her head turned so one golden eye could watch through the window. She had been in that position for hours. She did not make sound. She did not move. She only watched. Twice Dan had looked up from the table and met her eye through the glass. Both times he gave her a small, steady nod. Nothing more. But both times her breathing had slowed a little, the way breathing slows when a person chooses to hold on to a small piece of hope. When full dark came, Dan lit the 2 oil lamps on the shelf above the table and pulled them close. The warm yellow light fell across Kale's still face and the wrapped foreleg and the careful row of instruments and cloth strips laid out on the far end of the table. The fever had not broken yet. If anything, it had climbed a little in the early evening. Dan had expected this. Fever often climbed before it fell. The body was fighting. That was what fever meant. It was not the enemy. It was the sign that something inside was still pushing back. He changed the cloth wrapping on the leg just after dark, working carefully in the lamplight. The red line spreading from the wound had not grown longer. That was the first real sign he had been waiting for. He pressed his lips together and said nothing, but something in his shoulders dropped just slightly. He applied a fresh layer of the green mixture and wrapped the leg again with clean strips. That was when he heard a sound at the door. A soft knock. Careful, like someone who was not sure they should be there. Dan straightened and crossed the room. He opened the door. It was a young woman from the village. He knew her face. Her name was Ada and she lived 3 houses down with her husband and 2 small children. She was holding a cloth-covered pot in both hands and she looked at him with an expression caught somewhere between worry and determination. "I made soup," she said simply. "You have not eaten." Dan looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back and let her in. She set the pot near the fire without a word, looked at Kale on the table with wide and careful eyes, and then left just as quietly as she had come. She did not ask questions. She did not say anything else. She just came, left the food, and went. Dan stood in the open doorway for a moment after she left. Across the dark village road he could see small lights moving. Lanterns. People were still out. He had expected them all to go home by now, to lock their doors and leave the strange night behind them. But there were figures moving in the dark, quietly, without urgency. He watched for a moment, then went back inside. An hour later there was another knock. This time it was an older man named Reg, white-haired and slow-moving, who had been in Ashford longer than almost anyone. He handed Dan a small bundle without a word, fresh cloth, a wrapped block of pressed herb paste that Dan recognized as something good for fever, and a candle. He nodded once at Dan and walked away. Dan set the items on the shelf and stood still for a second, looking at them. Then, outside, he heard something different. He went to the window and looked out. Two people were approaching Sarah from the side of the road. They moved slowly and carefully, with their hands visible, the way a person moves when they want to make clear they mean no harm. One of them was carrying something large and folded. A blanket. A heavy one, the kind used in the coldest part of winter. The other was carrying a wooden board. On it were several large pieces of salted meat from the village storehouse. Dan watched. The two villagers stopped a few feet from Sarah's head. The dragon's golden eye moved to them and her body went still and tense. One of the villagers, a man Dan recognized as well from the far end of the road, slowly crouched down and placed the board of meat on the ground and pushed it gently toward her. Then he stood, took the blanket from the person beside him, and laid it over the ground near Sarah's side, not touching her, just near her. Then both of them stepped back. Sarah stared at them. She stared at the meat. She stared at the blanket. She looked back at the two figures now retreating quietly down the road. Her golden eye was very bright in the dark. She did not eat right away. She lowered her nose slowly toward the board and breathed in. Then she lifted her head and looked at Dan's window. He was still standing there watching. He gave her a small nod. She looked back at the meat. After a long moment she ate, slowly and carefully, like an animal that still was not sure it was allowed to. Dan turned back to the table. The night deepened. The village went quiet. Dan worked in the small warm circle of lamplight, checking and watching and waiting with the steady patience that had taken him years to build. He changed the wrapping once more around midnight. He added the pressed herb paste to the mixture on the wound. He covered Kale again with the folded cloth and sat back down on the stool. He must have slept for a short time, because when he opened his eyes the lamps had burned lower and the room was cooler. He sat up straight and pressed his fingers immediately to Kale's neck. The pulse was slower. He held very still. A slower pulse in the night could mean two very different things. He moved his hand to the cub's face and held it just above the nose. The breath that came out was warm and even. He pressed the back of his hand to the skin beside the wound. The heat was gone. He checked again. Pressed more firmly. Moved his hand to the forehead, to the throat, to the chest. Cool. Steady. Normal. The fever had broken. Dan sat back on the stool and put both hands flat on the table and breathed out long and slow. Outside the window the sky had gone from black to the very first thin edge of deep blue that comes just before morning. He stood and went to the window. Sarah was still there, her head resting on the ground, her golden eye open and watching. He placed his hand flat against the glass. She lifted her head slowly and pressed her nose against the other side of it. They came at mid-morning. There was no warning. No sound of wings until they were already close. Then the air above the village filled with a deep, heavy rush that bent the tops of the trees at the field edge and sent loose straw spinning off the rooftops. People stepped out of their doors and looked up and went very still. For dragons descended from the sky. They were nothing like Sarah. Sarah was large. These were enormous. The smallest of the four was at least twice her size. Their scales were dark and thick and carried the dull, heavy shine of old iron. Their wings spread wide as they dropped low over the village, and the shadow they cast moved across the rooftops like a slow storm cloud passing over the sun. They landed at the far edge of the village road. The ground shook when they came down. A clay pot fell off a window ledge somewhere and shattered. A dog bolted and did not come back. The four dragons folded their wings and stood in a line and looked at the village with eyes that were ancient and cold and gave nothing away. Hugh was already at the front of the road. He had been awake since before sunrise, expecting something like this. He had told the villagers to stay inside if anything happened. Most of them had not listened. They stood in doorways and peered around corners and watched from windows with pale, frightened faces. The largest of the 4 dragons stepped forward. He was old. The scales along his neck and jaw had gone a pale gray-green with age, and his eyes were a deep amber that caught the light and held it. He looked down at Hugh the way a mountain looks down at a stone at its base. He spoke. The sound was low and resonant and formed itself into words slowly, like something being carved rather than said. "Where is the cub?" It was not a question. Hugh opened his mouth and found that for a moment nothing came out. He cleared his throat. "He is alive," he said. "He is being cared for. He is safe." The elder dragon's amber eyes did not change. "Where?" Hugh turned and pointed to the small house at the end of the road. All 4 dragons looked at it. Sarah, who had been crouched beside the house all morning, stood up slowly when she saw them. She was tense. Her wings pressed flat against her back and her head lowered in a posture that was clearly respectful, but her body stayed positioned between the elder dragons and the door of Dan's house. She made a low sound. The elder looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the house. He moved forward down the road, and the other 3 followed. The villagers in the doorways pressed further back. Dan heard them coming. He had been awake for most of the night and had dozed briefly in the chair by the fire just before sunrise. When the ground began to shake with the landing he was already on his feet. He checked Kale first. The cub was awake. Properly awake, for the first time since Dan had brought him inside. His dark eyes were open and blinking slowly in the firelight, and he had shifted himself slightly on the table so his chin was resting on his folded forelegs. He was weak. He would be weak for some time yet. But he was awake and his eyes were clear and his breathing was full and even. Dan put a hand briefly on the cub's head and then went to the door and opened it. The elder dragon was already there. He was so large that he filled the entire view from the doorway, his head lowered to look at Dan directly. The amber eyes moved over Dan slowly, taking in the plain clothes, the tired face, the worn leather bag hanging on the hook beside the door. Then the elder looked past Dan into the house. He saw Kale. The cub lifted his head when he saw the elder and made a small, thin sound. Not distress. Recognition. The elder's expression shifted in a way that was very slight and very fast, something moving behind the ancient eyes that was gone almost before it appeared. He looked back at Dan. "You are the one who treated him," the elder said. "Yes," Dan said. "You are a healer." "I am." The elder was quiet for a moment. The 3 other dragons had spread out behind him, and Dan could feel their eyes on him like a physical weight. Sarah had moved to the side of the doorway, close but not blocking. "The infection he carried," the elder said slowly. "We have lost cubs to that infection before. We did not know what it was. We had no way to stop it." Dan nodded. "Thorn root resin. It is common in deep forest ground. The thorns break off and the resin enters the blood. I have treated it in animals before. I was not certain it would work the same way in a dragon, but the signs were the same." The elder looked at him steadily. "But you tried." "There was no reason not to," Dan said simply. The elder held his gaze for a long moment. Then he lowered his great head, just slightly, in a motion that felt deliberate and considered. "May I see him?" he said. Dan stepped aside. The elder dragon lowered himself carefully and brought his head through the doorway. It was a strange and remarkable thing to see something so enormous move with such care inside such a small space. He did not knock anything over. He did not rush. He brought his nose close to Kale and breathed in slowly. Kale stretched his neck forward and touched his nose to the elder's jaw. The elder stayed like that for a moment. Then he withdrew and straightened outside. He looked at Dan again. "What do you want?" the elder said. "Name it. What payment do you ask for what you have done?" Dan looked at him. He looked at the other 3 dragons behind him. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him with her golden eyes wide and still. He turned back to the elder. "I want Kale to recover fully," he said. "That is all." Silence. Not just from the elder. From everything. The whole road had gone completely quiet. The villagers in the doorways did not move. Hugh, standing halfway down the road, stood absolutely still. Even the wind seemed to stop for a moment. The elder looked at Dan without speaking. Then he turned his head slowly to the dragon on his left. That dragon looked back at him. Then the elder turned to the dragon on his right. A long look passed between them that carried something Dan could not read and did not fully understand. It was the kind of look that moves between people who have lived a very long time and seen very many things and do not need words to say what they are thinking. The elder turned back to Dan. He did not speak yet. He simply looked at the small, tired, plain-faced man standing in his doorway with a worn bag on the hook behind him and a healing cub resting at his hearth. And something in those ancient amber eyes changed. The elder dragon did not speak for a long time. He stood at the doorway and looked at Dan with those deep amber eyes, and the silence stretched out long and full, the kind of silence that has weight to it. The other 3 dragons behind him were still. Sarah was still. The whole village road was still. Then the elder spoke. "There is something we must do," he said. "It will take a short time. We ask that you wait." Dan nodded. "All right." The elder withdrew from the doorway and turned to the other 3 dragons. They moved together to the open ground at the edge of the village, just beyond the last house, where the road met the tree line. They stood in a loose half-circle and spoke to one another in low sounds that did not carry far. Dan could hear the tone of it but not the words. It was slow and measured and serious. Hugh walked quietly up the road and stopped beside Dan. "What are they doing?" he said under his breath. "I do not know," Dan said. They watched together from the doorway. After a few minutes Sarah moved away from the house and walked to where the elders stood. She lowered her head and spoke to them. One of the elders responded. Another looked at Dan across the distance. Then Sarah came back and stopped in front of Dan and looked at him with her golden eyes. "They are ready," she said. It was the first time she had spoken a word he could understand, and the sound of her voice was low and warm and carried a roughness in it from a long night of silent watching. "Will you come?" Dan looked at Hugh. Hugh looked back at him with an expression that said very clearly that he had no idea what was happening and was not sure anyone should walk toward 4 enormous dragons voluntarily. But he said nothing to stop him. Dan stepped out of the doorway. He walked down the road toward the tree line. The morning sun was fully up now and it fell warm across the village rooftops and across the open ground where the dragons stood waiting. Dan's boots were quiet on the packed earth. He was aware of the villagers watching from every doorway and window along the road. He was aware of the size of the creature standing before him. He was aware that his heart was beating faster than usual. He stopped a few feet from the half-circle of elders and waited. The largest elder stepped forward. He was carrying something, Dan realized. Something small, held carefully in the curved joint of one great foreleg. He brought it forward and lowered it to the ground in front of Dan. It was a stone. Flat and smooth and dark, about the size of a man's palm. Its surface had markings on it. Not scratched in but somehow pressed into the stone itself, clean lines that curved and crossed in a pattern that looked old beyond measure. The elder spoke. "In our oldest tradition," he said, "there is a title given only once in many generations. It has never been given to one outside our kind. It is called Flame Friend." He paused. It means that the one who carries it is known to every dragon clan across every territory as one who is to be honored, protected, welcomed for the full length of their life. Dan looked at the stone. He looked up at the elder. "It is yours," the elder said. "If you will accept it." Dan was quiet for a moment. The wind moved gently through the trees at the field edge. Somewhere down the road a child made a small sound and was hushed. "I did not help Kale for a title," Dan said. "We know," the elder said. "That is why we offer it." Dan looked down at the stone again. The markings on its surface seemed almost to move in the morning light, the curved lines shifting slightly the way reflections shift on water. He crouched down slowly and picked it up with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. Warm, even in the cool morning air. He straightened and held it carefully. The elder raised his head and made a sound. It was not loud, but it carried, the way a deep bell carries, felt as much as heard. The three other elders responded with the same sound, low and resonant, one after the other. The sound moved through the air and through the ground and through the chests of everyone standing in the road. Then it was done. The elder looked at Dan with his ancient amber eyes. "You are Flame Friend," he said simply. "It is permanent. It cannot be taken back." Dan stood with the warm stone in both hands and did not know what to say. So he said nothing. He gave a single slow nod and held the elder's gaze and hoped that was enough. It seemed to be. Then Sarah stepped forward. She moved slowly and with great care, the way she had moved when she first came to the village wall. She stopped directly in front of Dan and held his gaze for a moment. Then she lowered her head. All the way down. Her chin nearly touched the ground. Her great neck curved low and her eyes closed, and she stayed that way, completely still, in a gesture so full of meaning that it needed no explanation at all. Dan's throat tightened. He placed one hand gently on the top of her head, just for a moment, the way he would place a hand on the shoulder of someone he wanted to reassure. She did not move. Then a small sound came from the direction of the house. Everyone looked. Kale was in the doorway. He had climbed down from the table and made his way to the door on his own. He was unsteady on his legs and his wrapped foreleg made his movement slow and a little lopsided. He stood in the doorway blinking in the morning light with his dark eyes wide and his small ears turned forward. He looked at the elders. He looked at his mother. Then he looked at Dan. He stepped off the doorstep and came slowly across the ground. His movement was careful and deliberate, the way an animal moves when it is still healing but has made a decision and will not be talked out of it. He crossed the distance between the door and where Dan was standing and stopped right in front of him. He lifted his small foreleg. The wrapped one. He held it up with visible effort and pressed his small paw flat against Dan's hand. He held it there. Dan looked down at the little dark-scaled face looking up at him. The eyes were clear and steady and full of something that did not need a word. He turned his hand over slowly and held the small paw in his palm. Behind him he heard someone in the road make a sound. A soft, broken sound. He did not turn to look, but he heard it spread down the line of watchers, one person and then another, quiet and helpless, the sound people make when something reaches them somewhere they were not expecting. Hugh stood at the front of the road with his arms at his sides and his jaw set and his eyes very bright. Ada had both hands pressed over her mouth. Old Reg stood with his head bowed like a man in a place of worship. The elder dragons were still and quiet. Sarah lifted her head and watched her cub with her golden eyes full and soft. Dan stood in the morning sun with the warm marked stone in one hand and a small dragon's paw in the other and said nothing at all. He did not need to. Some things do not need words. Some things just need one person willing to step forward when everyone else steps back. One pair of steady hands in the dark. One small pot of green mixture and a roll of clean cloth and a night of patient watching. The world between humans and dragons had shifted. Not with a battle. Not with fire or force or fear. With a bowl of herb mixture and an open door and a man who simply looked at a crying mother and saw exactly what she needed. It would not be forgotten. Not by the clan. Not by the village. Not by a small cub named Kale who would grow large and strong and old, and who would carry a wrapped scar on his foreleg for the rest of his very long life, and who would never once forget the quiet man who sat beside him through the dark.